I had an affair with my wife's sister, and it put my wife in the hospital. Years later, I expected my child to step up and raise the kids I had with her, but instead, they turned on me and completely destroyed my life. I never thought I'd be writing something like this, but here we are. I'm posting because my oldest child has officially cut me off and, more importantly, filed paperwork that now limits when and how I can see my younger kids. According to them, I'm unsafe, manipulative, and the reason their mother is dead. I don't agree with that version of events, and I'm tired of being treated like I rewrote history when I've been painfully consistent about what happened. I'll get the obvious part out of the way because I know that's what everyone will focus on. Yes, I had an affair with my wife's sister. No, that is not what killed my wife. My wife and I were married for over a decade. We had our first child young, and from the outside, things probably looked stable. Inside the house, it was quiet in the worst way. We didn't fight much, but we also didn't talk about anything that mattered. She had a documented heart condition that we'd been managing for years. It was serious, but it wasn't something that stopped her from working, parenting, or living normally. Doctors told us what to watch for. We followed instructions. This wasn't some fragile situation where a stiff breeze would take her out. Her younger sister moved in with us after a messy breakup. It was supposed to be short-term. She didn't have much money, was emotionally all over the place, and leaned on us heavily. I took on most of the responsibility because that's how I operate. I fix things, I handle logistics, I keep the household running. My wife had checked out emotionally long before any of this happened. We were roommates raising a kid. The affair didn't start as some dramatic betrayal. It grew during a period where my wife barely acknowledged me, and her sister was constantly around, venting, spiraling, depending on me for stability. I'm not pretending it was noble. I'm saying it wasn't a calculated move to destroy my marriage. Eventually, my wife found out. There was a confrontation. I'm not going to dramatize it because people already do that enough. She became overwhelmed and collapsed. Emergency services were called within a reasonable amount of time. She was taken to the hospital and stabilized. She was conscious. She spoke to doctors. Days later, complications set in and she passed. What happened next is where things really broke. Her sister was pregnant. The timing made the situation ugly immediately, and I won't pretend otherwise. The family blamed me for everything. I made the decision to marry her sister because there was a child involved and because chaos helps no one. I believe structure mattered more than feelings at that point. My oldest child stayed with us. They never forgave me, but they also never left. They grew distant, colder, but I assumed time would do what it usually does. I was wrong. Years passed. More kids, more responsibility. My health started declining. Finances tightened, and the reality of raising multiple children with limited support set in. I expected my oldest child, now an adult, to help in a real way, not to replace me, not to sacrifice their entire life, but to step up the way families do when things get hard. Instead, they accused me of killing their mother. They said I caused her collapse. They said I delayed getting help. They said I replaced her like she never mattered. None of that lines up with medical records or reality, but facts don't seem to matter to them. They framed my expectation of help as manipulation and control. When I pushed back, they escalated. Now I'm dealing with lawyers. Now my access to my younger kids is monitored. Now my oldest child refuses contact entirely and tells anyone who will listen that I'm the villain of their life story. I'm not looking for sympathy. I know what I did was wrong, but I'm tired of being told that acknowledging responsibility means accepting blame for things that didn't happen. I didn't force my wife's heart to fail. I didn't erase her existence. I didn't abandon my kids. What I did was make decisions based on stability, not comfort. And now I'm being punished for not performing grief the way people wanted. So I'm asking this here because I genuinely want outside perspective, not moral theater. Am I actually the monster my child says I am? Or am I just the only one in this situation willing to make choices that don't feel good but keep things functioning? I'll update once things progress because clearly this situation isn't done unraveling yet. Update 1. I wasn't planning to update this fast, but a lot happened after I posted and it would feel dishonest to wait and pretend things are stable. They're not. I read most of the responses, not all of them, because after a while it stops being feedback and starts being people projecting their own trauma onto you. A lot of commenters latched onto the affair and stopped reading after that. I expected that. What surprised me was how many people seemed more invested in punishing me emotionally than actually engaging with what I was asking. There's this idea that if someone does one unforgivable thing, everything else about their life becomes irrelevant. That's not how reality works, even if it feels good to say online. That said, a few comments stuck with me, mostly the ones asking about my relationship with my oldest child before all of this blew up. I thought it was distant but functional. I now realize they've been carrying resentment a lot longer than I understood. We spoke a few days after my post. I reached out first, not to apologize, but to try to reset things. I wanted to talk logistics, expectations, and boundaries. Instead, it turned into the kind of conversation where you realize you and the other person are not even arguing about the same reality. They told me they've been in therapy for years. That alone wasn't shocking. What was shocking was how long. According to them, this started shortly after their mother died. They said they'd been encouraged to process the environment they grew up in, not just the loss itself. Apparently, I've been a recurring topic. They accused me of isolating their mother emotionally long before the affair, of controlling the household by being the only one who handled money, schedules, decisions. I don't agree with that framing. I've always been the person who takes responsibility when others don't want to. There's a difference between control and competence, but I'm realizing now that distinction doesn't matter if the other person already resents you. Then the conversation took a turn I didn't expect. They told me that years before the affair ever happened, my wife's sister had accused me of inappropriate behavior, not publicly, not legally, just within the family. According to my child, it was framed as something confusing that made her uncomfortable. The family talked about it, decided it was a misunderstanding, and moved on. I was never told because it would have blown things up for no reason. I was stunned. Not because I suddenly remembered something I'd buried, but because this was the first I'd ever heard of it. I told my child exactly that. They didn't believe me. They said of course I'd deny it, because denial is easier than accountability. What bothered me wasn't just the accusation, it was the timing. This story only came up now, years later, when everything else is already falling apart. When I pointed that out, they said that just proved how unsafe I'd always been to confront. At that point, I realized we weren't having a conversation. We were reenacting a script they've been rehearsing in therapy for years, and I was the villain no matter what I said. I'll be honest, that's where I got angry. I told them that if they were going to continue painting me as some kind of predator, then they shouldn't expect anything from me going forward. Financial support, inheritance, help of any kind. I didn't yell, I didn't threaten. I stated it plainly. If I'm irredeemable in their eyes, then we stop pretending this is a family relationship and start treating it like a legal one. They didn't react the way I expected. There was no panic, no backtracking, no emotional outburst, just a flat acknowledgement. That's when it hit me that I don't have leverage anymore. Whatever guilt or obligation I thought existed on their side is gone. Since then, communication has been minimal and cold. I can feel something shifting, and it's not in my favor. People I assumed were neutral have started keeping their distance. I don't know exactly what's being said about me, but I know narratives don't spread on their own. What's unsettling is that I still believe the facts are on my side. The medical timeline, the decisions I made, the way things actually unfolded, none of that has changed, but I'm starting to see that facts don't carry weight when someone's emotional story is already locked in. I don't feel guilty for defending myself. I feel frustrated that I'm being forced to defend myself against things I didn't even know I was accused of. For the first time, it feels like I'm not just losing my child, but losing control of the story entirely, and I don't think this is the end of it. Update 2. After my last update, I stopped trying to talk to my oldest child directly. It was clear that anything I said would either be twisted or added to a file somewhere. Instead, I did what I probably should have done earlier and spoke to a lawyer, not because I was planning to sue anyone, but because I needed to understand what exposure I actually had. When someone starts throwing around accusations, even vague ones, you don't stay passive and hope it blows over. That meeting was sobering. I was told very plainly that people don't request old school records, therapy notes, and hospital documentation unless they're building a narrative, not necessarily a criminal case, but something adjacent. Custody, supervision, control. The lawyer asked me questions I hadn't considered, like who had access to my wife's medical history, who spoke to doctors after she was hospitalized, and who was present during the early days after her death. Questions that made it obvious this wasn't just about feelings anymore. What stood out most was when the lawyer mentioned that medical timelines matter more than opinions. That stuck with me. I requested my wife's hospital records, not because I expected to find some dramatic smoking gun, but because I was tired of hearing that I delayed care without anyone actually pointing to proof. When I finally got access to them, I read through everything myself, not just summaries, but notes, timestamps, observations. What I found didn't match the story I'd been accused of repeating. According to the records, my wife had already been experiencing cardiac distress earlier that day. There were notes about symptoms she hadn't disclosed to me at the time, complaints logged hours before the confrontation ever happened. That doesn't erase the stress of what she walked in on, but it does complicate the idea that one moment caused everything. The timeline people have been clinging to isn't as clean as they want it to be. I felt vindicated and sick at the same time. Around the same period, things at home started changing in ways I couldn't ignore. My current wife became increasingly tense. She accused me of feeding information to my oldest child, of trying to make her look unstable, of turning people against her. None of that was true, but once suspicion sets in, logic stops mattering. She started checking my phone. She questioned where I was constantly. She drank more than she used to, usually late at night, usually alone. The house felt brittle, like everyone was waiting for something to crack, and then something else happened that I still don't know how to process fully. While organizing paperwork related to my wife's estate, I came across therapy notes I didn't know existed, not detailed transcripts, but summaries she'd requested copies of years ago and never shared. Reading them felt invasive, but at this point, everything already felt violated. Those notes painted a picture I wasn't prepared for. My wife believed her sister had been emotionally manipulating both of us long before the affair, that she leaned into vulnerability around me and resentment around her, that she positioned herself as indispensable. There were mentions of her sister mimicking routines, stepping into roles, acting like a replacement rather than support. My wife didn't accuse her outright of planning anything, but she clearly felt displaced in her own marriage. That was hard to sit with. It didn't make me innocent. It didn't rewrite what I did, but it did introduce a layer I hadn't considered. I'd spent years assuming I was the sole architect of the damage. Now I was realizing there may have been pressure points I never recognized because I wasn't looking for them. At the same time, this new information made everything more unstable. My wife sensed the shift in me. She asked what I was digging for. She accused me of trying to blame her for my choices. When I didn't engage, she spiraled further. More drinking, more paranoia, more accusations that everyone was conspiring against her. And then my oldest child doubled down. Through legal channels, I was informed that additional documentation had been submitted to justify ongoing supervision with my younger kids. Not new evidence, but reinterpretations of old events. It became clear that no amount of factual correction was going to undo the emotional version of the story they'd committed to. I'm starting to understand something that's deeply uncomfortable. This isn't about what actually happened anymore. It's about who gets to define it. The more I uncover, the more isolated I become. The more context I find, the less anyone seems to care. I feel like I'm standing in the middle of a room with all the lights on, pointing at what's actually there, while everyone else insists on staring at shadows they're more familiar with. I still believe responsibility matters. I still believe stability matters. But I'm beginning to see that being right doesn't protect you when the narrative has already moved on without you. And something tells me this isn't even the worst of it yet. Update 3. I didn't plan to post again this soon, but things shifted in a way I didn't expect, and I need to get this out while it's still clear in my head. This isn't closure, it's just where things landed. After my last update, the house stopped functioning. That's the only way to describe it. Everything felt tense and brittle. The kids were confused, my oldest was completely gone emotionally, and my wife was spiraling in a way I hadn't seen before. She wasn't sleeping, she was drinking earlier and earlier in the day. She kept checking doors and windows like someone was coming for her. Every conversation turned into an accusation that I was plotting something or turning people against her. I wasn't engaging anymore. I'd already learned that reacting only made things worse. I started keeping notes, dates, behaviors, things said in front of witnesses. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I could feel things slipping out of my control and I wasn't going to be caught flat-footed again. The breaking point came on a night that started mundane. The kids were asleep. We were arguing about finances and childcare, the same looping fight we'd been having for months. It escalated fast. She went from defensive to frantic. At some point, the argument stopped being about the present and turned into the past. Not just the affair, but everything around it. That's when she unraveled. She finally admitted she'd planned the affair long before it happened. Not in some cinematic way, but deliberately. She said she'd felt invisible her whole life next to her sister, that she watched our marriage decay and saw an opening. She said she knew when to lean in and when to pull back. She admitted she pushed moments that shouldn't have crossed lines and then acted shocked when they did. Then she said something that made the room go quiet in a way I can still feel in my chest. She knew about her sister's condition, not vaguely. Specifically, she knew stress was dangerous. She knew confrontation could trigger an episode, and she didn't stop the confrontation from happening. She didn't plan for my wife to end up in the hospital, but she didn't stop it either. She said she thought if the truth came out, things would finally reset and she'd be chosen. I didn't yell, I didn't react, I just listened. She went on. She said getting pregnant wasn't an accident. She said she believed once there were kids involved, everything would settle into place and no one would question it. She talked about security like it was a prize, not a responsibility. Then came the part that reframed everything with my oldest. She admitted she'd told my child years ago that I was the reason their mother collapsed, that I delayed calling for help, that I froze, that I chose her over their mother in that moment. She said she did it because she thought my child would hate me enough to never trust me again, which would force them closer to her. I don't think she understood what she was admitting in real time, or maybe she did and just couldn't stop. I didn't confront my oldest with this immediately. I needed to verify what I could. I spoke to my lawyer the next morning. I scheduled an emergency evaluation through channels I didn't even know I had access to until recently. I didn't threaten, I didn't plead, I documented. Within days, my wife was admitted for inpatient treatment, not because she was evil or dangerous, but because she was unraveling and saying things that couldn't be unsaid. The house went quiet again, but this time it was an empty quiet. Custody shifted temporarily. The younger kids stayed with me. Supervision was added, not because I was accused of anything new, but because everything was now under a microscope. When I finally told my oldest what their stepmother had admitted, it didn't land the way I thought it would. There was no relief, no recalibration, just distance. They said they didn't believe it, or maybe they said they didn't care. It was hard to tell. That's when it hit me that facts weren't the currency here. Time was, damage was. From the outside, this probably looks like a reversal, like I'm trying to reframe myself as manipulated instead of responsible. That's not what this is. I made choices. I own that. But the narrative that I orchestrated everything, that I killed their mother through negligence or malice, isn't accurate, and now I know where it came from. What's unsettling is realizing how long this version of events lived in my child's head, how many decisions they made, how much resentment calcified based on something planted deliberately. I don't feel vindicated. I feel cold, like I've been standing in the wrong courtroom my entire life arguing the wrong case. Right now, my wife is getting help. My oldest is gone. The younger kids are confused and asking questions I can't answer without breaking something else. And I'm sitting with the uncomfortable truth that even when the roles flip, the damage doesn't undo itself. I don't know if this makes me less of a villain in your eyes. It doesn't really matter. What I know is that whatever comes next, it won't be loud. I'm done trying to be understood by force. I'll update again when there's something final to say. Final update. This will be my last post. Not because everything is fixed, but because nothing else is going to change in a way that matters. My wife is still in treatment. I won't go into details because it doesn't help anyone, and honestly, it stopped being my business in the way people assume it is. She's stable enough now to participate in custody discussions, and that's where most of the focus has been. The younger kids are with me most of the time, with structured visits built around her care plan. Everything is supervised, documented, and clinical. It feels less like a family and more like a case file. Financially, I'm fine. That seems to bother some people, but it's the truth. I planned for contingencies long before any of this exploded. There was no dramatic collapse there. If anything, the stability made everything else feel colder, like I could survive anything except being wanted. The real ending came from my oldest. They reached out once, not to reconcile, not to argue, just to settle something cleanly. We met in a neutral place with no expectation of fixing anything. I went in thinking this would finally be the moment where facts mattered, where the confession, the documentation, the proof of manipulation would shift something. It didn't. They already knew. That was the part I didn't see coming. They knew their stepmother had pushed the affair. They knew she framed the story about their mother's collapse. They knew things were more complicated than the version they carried for years. They found out slowly, through therapy, through their own digging, through watching patterns repeat themselves. They blamed me anyway. Not because they thought I murdered their mother, not because they believed I delayed help, but because when everything shattered, I didn't choose to stop. I didn't choose to be alone. I chose continuity. I chose the person who made the damage survivable instead of sitting inside the damage itself. From their perspective, that choice mattered more than intent or accuracy. It told them something about their place in my priorities that couldn't be undone later with explanations. They weren't angry when they said all of this. That's what stuck with me. There was no yelling, no dramatics, just a flat clarity that felt worse than being hated. They told me they were changing their name, not out of spite, but to separate themselves from a family story they didn't want to keep carrying. They'd already started the process, legal, clean, irreversible. They weren't asking permission or forgiveness, they were informing me. That was the moment I understood this wasn't about punishment, it was about closure, and I wasn't part of what they needed to close. We ended the meeting politely. No promises to stay in touch, no vague statements about time healing things. Just an understanding that this was the last page of that relationship. Since then, life has narrowed. My days are structured around work and the kids. School drop-offs, appointments, grocery lists, homework at the kitchen table. On the surface, it probably looks like I landed on my feet. People assume that because there's no visible collapse, there must be some kind of victory. There isn't. The truth is documented now. Medical timelines, therapy notes, confessions. It's all there, preserved and validated. If this were a court case about facts, I'd be satisfied with the outcome. But facts don't rebuild trust, and they don't make someone feel chosen after the moment has passed. I didn't lose everything. That's important to say. I didn't end up alone in a dramatic sense. I still have responsibilities, routines, and a future that's technically intact. What I lost was narrower and heavier.